Welcome to this episode of Compliance Lab with myself, Sarah Sawyer, an attorney at Offit Kurman, and Rose Healy, a labor economist with Resolution Economics. And today we are talking about pay equity. It's something that folks hear often in the context of women making 83 cents on the dollar, or they might see it in headlines as it relates to new equity bills or different things that might be passed in their various jurisdictions, or they might see it in the headlines as pay transparency. But really, ultimately, pay equity laws really come down to trying to make sure that everyone is earning the same wages for the same work. And a big federal law that is involved here that companies are subject to is the Equal Pay Act of 1963, which is around sex-based wage discrimination for equal work. So that's a main one when we're talking about pay equity. And then there's a lot of state equivalents to that law as well that may have more stringent requirements and things. But ultimately, all of these laws that we're going to be mentioning or referring to or alluding to all have to do with equal pay for equal work, regardless of what your gender is, what your race is, your religious affiliation, any of those protected characteristics that you might see. And again, some states have very specific ones that go above and beyond the federal, but that's what we're talking about. And obviously these things come up in a couple different contexts. And pay transparency is one that I want to start with because a lot of times people see these things as confusing. What's pay equity, pay transparency? What do those words mean? What are we even talking about? And I think a good way to think about it is pay equity is at the top. That's the main thing we're after when we're talking about these laws and what employers need to be paying attention to. And then all the laws that come underneath of that different jurisdictions might enact to serve that purpose come with lots of different names or ways that they're referred to or different policies, procedures, things that they're trying to effectuate that same purpose. Pay transparency is one of the big ones that people will definitely see in the news or in their travels or when you're looking for a job or you're putting a posting out there. That's really where they come into play because pay transparency is all around exactly as it sounds. Other people being able to know and understand what other similarly situated people are making for the same job, whether that's a range or the exact amount. Because the idea there is if people know the information, that they can take action if it's inequitable. And when I say would people know that information, that could be a candidate, that could be employees knowing what others make within a company. It could be a local government, which we're seeing now in a couple of jurisdictions where they're asking for information, which also has to do with transparency and providing information to try to understand whether there's equitable pay going on within organizations. The general concept there is the more you know. It's a little reading rainbow-ish. The more you know, for those of you who are familiar with that slogan. And it's the more that people know that they can actually take action, because otherwise, how would they know that something is inequitable? And just obviously being able to get that information is key because there's a lot of data that goes into pay and deciding what folks are paid and whether it's equal, because on the surface, it seems pretty simple, right? If I'm a plumber and I have 5 years of plumbing experience and I fix toilets just like anybody else, like, all right, me and the plumber next to me, we should make the same amount of money, do the same thing. Easy. It's really never that easy. Rose. A lot more that easy, yeah. Yes. So it can be really challenging to figure these things out. I think if I was a business owner, I'd be asking myself, how do I figure this out? Obviously, one piece is to know what you need to comply with, and that's the state laws and the federal laws. And they might say, hey, you need to provide this information to these people, and it might give you these instructions. But how do you know if the information that you're providing is compliant or not? What does compliance actually look like?
Right. And I really appreciate that we're having this conversation, Sarah, because it's definitely becoming, I think, a new baseline, this pay transparency. We see in the news pretty much every day some updates on what states are now considering it, what states have passed some pay transparency laws. What we want to do is help our clients know what to submit, but also be able to feel confident that their pay data will show that they're compliant and that they're not violating any anti-discrimination laws when it comes to how they pay their employees. Yeah, and like you said, just It also depends on what jurisdiction you're in. If you're an organization that touches multiple states, there's currently somewhat of a patchwork. The awareness of what to look for depending on where your workforce is very important. From my experience, we're looking, for example, at helping some of our clients in Illinois that have to submit pay data, and the data submission required under that program it's somewhat straightforward, but it has very specific rules as to what that data should look like, how you should format it, and all that. Just being aware of those little things that might differ across states and across local jurisdictions really help a lot. And beyond just knowing what to submit, like I said, it's really important to understand, well, what is this agency, whoever you're submitting it to, what are they going to find? Because they probably will conduct their own analysis. So it's best to know and to be able to anticipate and to be able to defend if questions do come up. And questions will come up because pay transparency does generate these conversations, even among employees, among applicants, and like you said, within government agencies that are looking at this pay data. Being able to prepare yourself by, say, proactively auditing your pay practices, whether that's working through your policies and making sure that there is no language there that might signal some sort of discriminatory practice, but also importantly, looking at your data, because your data will show how your policies are actually being translated into real life and what your employees are seeing in terms of what they're being paid. Being able to look at those from a data perspective, but also from a policy perspective, which I think, Sarah, you're much better at than I am, but just being able to identify where the risk areas are when it comes to what's written, how it's implemented, and how it ultimately is shown in data and in real life, and how your employees are experiencing your decisions and their pay.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. But I think if you zoom out, obviously there's, as you mentioned, a patchwork is a good term for it. There's just like a lot of other things in employment law and with employees in general, given that there's a lot of different state requirements versus federal. And then a lot of these things are so fact and database that it can be really challenging. If you zoom out and you just really think, what are my goals here before you even start layering in what these requirements are to be compliant? And you start saying, all right, as an organization, if I have a good feel for my compensation structure, it's a good business practice in general, I will say as well, just because if you've got a good sense of what you're paying people, if you've got a good compensation strategy for your various bands within your company, even smaller companies, if you have a good understanding of the market for these types of roles and how you're paying people, how you're making the decisions to increase pay, how you're proactively making those decisions to keep up with market factors, you'll have a lot of other great benefits from that as well from a retention perspective. But if you've got your arms around that and you have done the analysis yourself just to see if really you're doing everything you should be doing to help with retention and help with culture and help with recruiting and help with all of these business functions for needing to have a good comprehensive plan as it relates to your compensation, that will layer much better into having to handle the compliance part of it. And from a timing perspective, when you speak about proactivity, it's so important because I just think about the moment where you want to go in one of these jurisdictions that has a transparency law where you need to post on the posting, for instance, a pay range for that role. And you have to have specific language for that. And the lawyer like myself can help make sure you got all the special words on there that you need. Yeah, but you don't want to have a need and then be trying to work backwards from that and say, have an attorney like myself say to you, you're going to have to include compensation on this. You're going to have to publish this. You don't want to be working backwards from that moment saying, oh crap, I don't really know what that range can be. Because most of the time when you have a need, you have a need. You don't want to be having to figure this all out then. Because it's like you have to kind of work backwards if you haven't been proactive on this. You have to say, what is that pay band? Like, what does that even look like? How is posting this going to impact my other employees? If I post this as required by the law, is one of my current employees going to look at this who's similarly situated and it's going to be way higher than what they're making? And what kind of cultural impact or retention impact is that going to have? And companies who are on top of these things, understanding and have their arms around why they're making the decisions that they're making, have good policies in place, have regular checks in place to start to check on these things. Because a lot of this stuff happens. Very few of my clients, and I'm sure it's true for you as well, Rose, set out in the morning to say, oh, I just really want to discriminate against people or not pay them equally. Or I'm sure there's those people out there, but I fortunately don't run into them very often. Most of the time, it's that people get busy with something else and they don't even realize what's happening fully and the impact of or Sometimes it's unconscious bias. There's different things. So it's just a great practice to be thinking about these things. I can't speak enough for proactivity in this sport.
Yeah. And I think in terms of proactive work, it makes sense to have these checkpoints. We usually see in our work, it's looking at it every year prior to any merit increases being implemented. Let's say there are some pay raise recommendations from certain managers. Ideally, you would go in and look at what the potential impacts are of those recommendations and then be able to address any gaps in risk areas before these recommendations are actually implemented. So I would say probably an easy way to schedule that is around that time when pay raises are happening, which probably for a lot of organizations would be beginning of the year or maybe around now close to the end of the year. Certainly something to be thinking about alongside all the pay transparency laws that are popping up everywhere and obviously the equal pay laws that have always been there. So just something to maybe helpful to keep in mind that you already go through all these cycles of setting pay could be helpful to think about just instituting it around then to make sure that you're tracking all of these decisions.
Yeah. I'm always in favor of when you're under the hood already to start to take a look at things. It's always when you're taking the time to take a pause, be thoughtful about it. And I know you mentioned policies as well and policies around, but it also provides clarity. So if employees know that you're looking at compensation on a regular basis, and it's just a good tool in general so that employees have certainty, they understand the cycle. So it brings some semblance of order to everything and hopefully removes bias and helps you have a set time to start looking into things. But usually that goes with some type of communication with the employee as well, which is welcomed by employees so that they have an understanding of what that looks like. And something else that's good to mention in this context, that was like the original version of pay transparency before we got to a point where we were posting it on job postings and doing some of those types of things that we see more often now is people talking about their wages with each other. So a lot of states have those laws in place as well. And sometimes when I'm reviewing handbooks or policies, there might be something in there that indicates that maybe people shouldn't be sharing with each other what they're making, or maybe I'll have a client call me and say, can I terminate this person or talking about their wages to somebody else? And if you're making that call to somebody, that's a really good sign that you don't have your house in order as far as a good understanding. If that's what your fear is, that if people talk about their wages, that it's going to hurt you, then you have a long way to go, I think, in having a good system in place and having a good understanding. Because I think a lot of that fear, not to make those people feel bad that they're listening, but I think it's a good triggering event for you to say, well, if my fear is around, if everyone knew what they were making, that might cause a problem. You probably want to stop and say, why is that? Like, why is that my concern? And is it because I haven't been looking at people's pay enough to make sure that I'm keeping up with the market or that everything's balanced? Or usually that fear is coming from something being met. So it's less about the employees themselves. It's so much more about the realization, like, I haven't spent the time I need to on this, and maybe I should examine that. So that's a good triggering, barring having to do this for, you mentioned Illinois has where people have to be proactively submitting data. New York just passed a similar bill that is going to have some similar things in place. Even setting that step aside that you're going to have to do, there's some of those practical day-to-day things that come up as well.
Right. Yeah. And just one final point I'd like to add is once you're in there, once you understand your pay practices, once you understand where your risk areas are, then you're in a really good position to defend yourself if there are claims that go into litigation, for example. Sometimes we see in our work, there's an expert on the other side that will say, look, I looked at the data, doesn't look good. And you can have someone on your side that's already been looking at this, and you pretty much know exactly what the explanations are when you're doing all of this proactive work. So just something else to think about. So litigation can be avoided, but sometimes depending on what you're looking at, they might just come up and hopefully it won't surprise you because you're prepared and you can have people working with you to be able to defend yourself there.
Yeah. And then make positive changes moving forward for the future and making sure that you've got good policies in place and doing all that cleanup. Because obviously, when things go fully wrong, that's what it feels like when litigation happens. Obviously, right, is always the half glass full part is you get to look at it as an opportunity to be proactive next time and be on top of it moving forward.
Right. Right.
Thanks, Rose. It's a great topic. And I look forward to talking to you again soon on something else equally as fun and exciting.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, Rose.